Hi, welcome to this webinar on the German election results and what they mean for foreign and security policy. We're coming to you from deep in the headquarters of the ECFR Berlin office, and we're going to try to understand what the election results, such as they were, mean. I think we have, a little bit more clarity than we did yesterday, but actually not as much clarity as you usually get from elections, especially German elections. So there's still quite a bit of uncertainty. We're going to try to unpack that, particularly with regards to foreign and security policy. I think, as is the nature of such things in a moment like this, we'll probably end up speaking about domestic politics a lot, but we think we know something about that too, so we'll try to let that bleed in. I think we have a real expert panel for that today. On my right, appropriately, we have Jana Puglierin, who is the director of ECFR's Berlin office. And on my left, less appropriately, we have Janka Oertel, who's the director of ECFR's Asia program. Gustav Gressel was supposed to join us, but he's been unable to due to a family issue. So we're going to try to struggle along without him and fill in the Russia gaps as needed. So I think it will be really important. We want this to be a conversation with you. We can't actually see you, or we're not even really sure you're out there. So it would be great if you could use the Q&A function to ask questions at any time, and we'll be picking those up here and trying to bring you into the conversation that way. Otherwise, it could get very awkward, so please do that. But I want to start off, while you guys think of your questions and ways of trapping us, with the sort of most general foreign policy and security question that comes from the election. We don't know what the government is, we don't know what the coalition is, we don't even know who the chancellor is, but we have a certain idea that it's likely to be either a so-called traffic light coalition, which is SDP, Free Democrats and Greens, or a Jamaica coalition, which is the Union, those Greens and the Free Democrats. So what are the foreign policy and security policy differences, particularly when it comes to Europe and China, between those two coalitions, and what should we prefer depending on those issues? So Jana, let's start with you, and I'd be particularly interested in your views on the European piece of that.
Thanks, Jeremy. So maybe I start with a general observation. So it might take forever to form this new German government. We've seen 6 unprecedented months of negotiations in 2017. And I think because both Armin Laschet and Olaf Scholz will try to build a coalition, that could take forever. And just in terms of consequences for Europe, this is very unfortunate timing, because we have the upcoming French Council presidency and we have the upcoming French election. So there is only a little window also for the French Council presidency, where kind of the French are really focused on the EU and where things can be done. And what I fear is that we will have this vacuum coming from Germany for a long time, this uncertainty, and there are some important decisions that need to be made already in spring, for example, when it comes to what to do with the Stability and Growth Pact. And we have Macron pushing, and then kind of a caretaker government in Berlin would not kind of be very helpful, I think. So this is just a general remark. Once one of the two, at the moment, possible coalitions is formed, I think the kind of an SPD-led or a CDU-led coalition on many issues wouldn't make such a big difference when it comes to foreign and security policy. I think we would see something that Mark Leonard always calls the beauty of small differences.
The narcissism of small differences.
Oh, the narcissism, yeah, right.
Yeah.
The narcissism of small differences.
Which is different than beauty, although not like the narcissism.
So I think both Olaf Scholz and Armin Laschet have campaigned to become basically Merkel's heir, to be Merkel in a suit, up to the point when kind of campaign slogans were copied by Olaf Scholz and the famous hand gesture. And so I think on foreign policy, especially when it comes to Russia and China, Laschet and Scholz have basically embraced continuity. They both endorsed Nord Stream 2, And yeah, I think the change would come only from the FDP and the Greens. And maybe Janka can tell us more how likely that is when it comes to China. I think when it comes to Russia, it's not really likely that things will look completely different, which is also a good thing because, I mean, Germany, we won't go rogue, we won't go wild, we will be stable, steady, but also everybody who has hope for change, including, I think, at least 2 people on this panel, maybe 3, will be given a hard time because I think, yeah, there is only so much change that is possible. I think maybe we can do that in a second round. We need to dive deeper into security and defense. I think there you see differences in a traffic light and Jamaica coalition on the EU level, I would say so. But overall, on transatlantic relations, Russia and China, I think we would see a lot of continuity.
Continuity is always a good guess in a German context. Very often you change the players, but you leave the game the same. Is that the case, Janka, in China and Asia too? Or we always heard during the election campaign that Armin Laschet was very weak or wet, I suppose we would say, on China. Do you think that there is a difference between these coalitions when it comes to Asian policy?
Yeah, I actually think that there is a lot more in store there because the game is changing. The game itself is changing around Germany, and whereas there is a strong wish for continuity to maintain the status quo, you will actually require a lot of change, and that is a bit of an absurd situation that you find yourself in as a government that wants to, that preaches continuity and that preaches stability, is that you actually need to do radical change. Now, in any constellation, when the FDP and the Greens are on board, there's a great realization for that in both parties. Both of them have understood that China is probably the largest foreign policy challenge if you look at it more from like a decade perspective. So I do expect that there is actually going to be a lot of change, not least because the Chinese government will treat Germany quite differently if it's not led by Merkel, where there is a close relationship. Neither of the candidates does have the same standing in Beijing. And so that will lead to necessarily an even further changing of the environment and in which policymaking can take place. I do think also that from the perspective of what is in store in terms of what's already there in the ministries, etc., there's a lot of desire for change on the China policy question because it did feel like an issue area where Germany was kind of behind the curve. And this could have a reinforcing effect if there's a little bit of a lid lifted off of that, because if there is a bit of a desire there to start changing things, that there could be a dynamic coming from within the system as well that is actually bringing about much more radical change than we're expecting right now, and radical change with German characteristics, as you would say from a Chinese perspective. I mean, we don't expect a revolution here, but I do think that tonality.
Everything's relative, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is, okay, you've laid the basis for that there will be some change in China policy, no matter who is the leader. But does it matter who the leader is for that? I mean, what are the differences between the CDU and the SDP-led coalitions and between Laschet and Scholz in this policy area?
So what's interesting is that the Social Democrats have come forward with a position paper on China in the last legislation. They have positioned themselves very clearly on issues like 5G. So in the Bundestag, you actually have a group of parliamentarians that is quite skeptical about the current approach taken on China. You also had the foreign ministry moving forward on certain issues with a much stronger impetus than on the CDU side. On the CDU side, there are voices for change that are quite strong, but not all of them are kind of, there's a bigger struggle going on around this. And also there is more of a kind of, there's still a way to go in terms of the intellectual shift that needs to take place, and the changing of the debate inside the party about China not being an opportunity necessarily, but actually a problem for Europe's industrial policy, for Germany.
Are you saying then you think that the CDU will be a little bit, if it's a CDU-led coalition, that it will be very difficult for them to move forward on some of these changes? Or
I think the problem with China is that it's not a foreign policy issue anymore, and therefore it is kind of a cross-cutting government issue. It will be closely intertwined with climate policy. It will be closely intertwined with industrial policy, and therefore it will touch upon all the ministries that are also led by everyone else. So there will necessarily need to be a much bigger kind of consensus building going on. And I do think on this specific issue, the smaller parties will have a larger influence on foreign policy making than we currently expect, because the fact that this portfolio has been stuck in the chancellery for so long, I think that would change because it cannot be no longer be held so closely and so tightly there as much predictions.
That's really interesting, and it sort of leads right into the second question that I wanted to get at, which is about the FDP, which will be one of these junior partners, which people are predicting, broadly speaking, will in almost any of the scenarios that we're talking about have the finance ministry. And I think the theme that you just brought up is that actually you're not going to be making foreign policy just from the Chancellery and the Foreign Ministry anymore, to the extent that you even already were, that other ministries, particularly the Finance Ministry and the Climate Ministry, but many others will be involved in this. And it's particularly true when it comes to China, but I think it's true when it comes to most issues these days. So the FDP has basically run very strongly on a platform of not really spending any more money. And all of the platforms that you, foreign policy platforms, when it comes to China, which is about investment, when it comes to Europe, which is about debt neutralization and being a little bit easier on deficits, require quite a lot of spending and efforts from the finance ministry. So I'd like to hear from both of you how you think that the FDP's hold on the finance ministry, assuming that's where we end up, will affect the foreign policy that you just described for either of these coalitions.
So maybe I start with the EU level, because, yeah, as I already said, there are some important issues that need to be dealt with. The Stability and Growth Pact and what to do with it, and also the question whether the Recovery Fund, Next Generation EU, was kind of a one-off historical example, like the CDU, but also very much the FDP likes to think, or whether there will be some continuity. And I think that the FDP had positioned itself very strongly on all these issues. So basically, they want to undo the kind of spending approach that we've seen during the coronavirus crisis, and they want to turn back to an approach based on, yeah, call it austerity or whatever, but
fiscal prudence.
Yeah, so they are so very much against making the kind of Next Generation EU instrument a role model for future projects, very much against any issue to water down the Stability and Growth Pact. And here the SPD and the Greens even also have other ideas. They want to focus on investment, on kind of not kind of cutting the little growth that we've seen after the pandemic, but to boost it, whereas the FDP is not so much in favor of this. And I think that will be one of the most important issues in a traffic light coalition, how to solve this, because the SPD and the Greens will have a very ambitious EU agenda, and the FDP in general also is a very EU-friendly party. They have a very ambitious program, but in this specific area, they just think the way to making things better on the EU level is more frugalish than in Southern, let's put it like this.
Frugalish, okay. I think we're getting some good linguistic innovations here. And that might be useful in an FDP-led finance ministry. I think it has a frugalicity. Yeah. So what will that frugalicity mean for China policy more specifically? Jana mentioned the importance of investment for the programs, and that's, I think, particularly true in the China case.
I would say it's again different on the China issue because that is one of competition. It's one about future prosperity, it's about digitalization, it's about innovation. These are the topics that the FDP also ran on. So they also know that you cannot buy your way into a competitive future without any investments at all. So it's about the kind of investments that are going to be taken, the kind of industrial policy that is going to be constructed. So if you look at what's been coming out so far, it's not that there's an opposition against industrial policy, it's what does that look like? And in that sense, that could actually be a good combination between what the Green Party wants and what the FDP wants, because they are actually quite similar in some of these future-oriented topics in a way of where do you want to position Germany in the future as a competitive player within Europe. And I think that could make a lot of sense.
I mean, the problem is it kind of state-centered? Is the state the main actor, or is it private industry? And I think that's the same for EU growth. The FDP,
but for good reasons, I think Annalena Baerbock was kind of endorsed by the German Federation of Industries. There's not an opposition within the Green Party to do that. So that could be an interesting movement between the two, kind of interesting development happening between the two, pushing for on the specific kind of competitiveness with China, future competitiveness on renewable energies, all of these areas.
Sure, but I mean, if you say they're not in, they're against deficits, not against investment, which is like, you know, something that politicians say.
But in the end, they can blame the spending on their coalition partner. You know, it's a good thing.
Yeah, so all of that can work out, but like really getting down to the brass tacks of it, if you make more investment, you create more spending. There's ways around that, and that's my question for whether the FDP is willing to accept this. You can think of that. You can think of that investment in industrial policy and innovation policy as something which might go sort of off books in a certain way and not count against the deficit. FDP has put themselves squarely against that type of accounting. Is that something they're going to be willing to compromise on?
I've seen a comment in the chat that we are difficult to understand because there is a lot of echo. So maybe
we just move a little bit closer to the mic.
We
can totally do that.
To make that a nice
be mindful of our audience here as well.
Audience.
Sorry, we'll go ahead.
No, I just say that I'm not knowledgeable enough on where the FDP stands on that exactly to give you a proper answer on that.
Do you have any insights into that? No. All right, we'll leave that as an exercise for the audience, but we also do have some questions from the audience. The first one is from Jared Rexsider, if I got that right. What are your preliminary thoughts on the impact of the elections on leadership and other dynamics at the EU level, particularly when it comes to the French Council presidency? Jana, I mean, you mentioned this a little bit in your initial answer, but it's not just about the vacuum. It's also about the fact that Merkel, even once they form the coalition, Merkel will be gone. A lot of the impulse even will come from Macron, because he's always had impulse, and maybe now the Germans will listen. And even Italy, under Draghi, seems to have quite a lot of heft at the EU level these days. So how is this election going to change the leadership dynamics at the EU level?
So I move a bit closer, Jeremy, closer to the center. So I think the good news for our French friends is that Armin Laschet and Olaf Scholz, and also certainly Annalena Baerbock, would be very open to working closely with the French. That's the one thing Armin Laschet has also publicly criticized Angela Merkel for not having responded to the Sorbonne speech and for not having been welcoming enough, basically. And so I think overall we would see an attempt to build the relationship with the French, but I think most of the problems between France and Germany are structural and don't depend on personnel. So there is only kind of limited room, I think, for this kind of new romance between the two. The new chancellor, whether it will be Armin Laschet or Olaf Scholz, will be elected by 1/5 of the German population at max, and will need to govern a three-party or party family. We count the CDU-CSU as one party, but they are actually two, and you feel that very often, including during this election campaign. So in a Jamaica or traffic light coalition, it will be not easy to keep everybody on board and to find a compromise. So the new chancellor, I think, has much more to do at home in order to form coalitions and in order to govern than Angela Merkel, because I think part of her enormous power in the EU was based on the fact that she was spared all these political upheavals that we've seen in France, kind of the crash of the party system in Italy and Spain. So Germany was always the beacon of stability, political stability. And I think we see a change in our party landscape that makes it more difficult for any next chancellor. Also, another aspect, I think, is that we haven't seen real economic reforms in Germany for a long, long time. But what we've seen in the pandemic was that we lag behind when it comes to digitalization, innovation, public infrastructure, all that. And I think that kind of Germany as this growth engine, as this powerhouse, might have more difficult times ahead. And maybe that will also affect German power on the EU level. Given all that, I think that we might see maybe a less German-centric European Union, also because what you said, all the other players come in. Draghi wants to shape things, Sanchez wants to shape things. Macron wants, after he gets re-elected, shape things. But then again, a lot of the German power so far has been structural, and the German chancellor is a German chancellor, so of course will be playing a very important role.
That's a very think tank answer. Which is, definitely it will change unless it doesn't. But I think, but I take your point. Yeah. Maybe we can ask that question on a slightly more specific way with regards to China, which is, will Germany be willing or able to lead the rest of Europe on China policy under this new configuration, or will that mantle pass to somebody else? I've heard the French are quite interested in the Indo-Pacific recently.
Yeah, I heard that too. So arguably, Germany has not led European China policy, but Germany has led a successful German China policy. So far, that had an impact on the EU. So I think that's the big question. That is whether
well, there's two ways to lead: by moving forward and making everybody else follow you, or by coordinating.
Or by just running away and leaving the rest behind, and then just kind of. I mean, that's the question. I think is how much can Europe be integrated into a German-China strategy, and the parties that are now running for building this and forming this government are quite conscious of the fact. So I think the future of German China policy lies in further Europeanizing it, integrating it more. And there I think is a nuance between the SPD that sees a very much like Franco-German axis there as the engine for a European China policy, whereas other parties want to even further Europeanize it. And I do think that this can lead to frictions within the European Union. I mean, bringing Warsaw on board, bringing Rome on board, bringing Madrid on board, bringing the Dutch on board. I think this is going to be a big question of how can you really broaden the approach to China from a European perspective. And it's really not trivial, because if you have a Franco-German anchor in this, then this can obviously move forward more energetically and quickly and all of these things. But we've seen around the comprehensive agreement on investment what it does, and it creates not necessarily a stable political outcome, let's put it like that. So I think bridging all of those differences in China policy or in the assessment of China, understanding how much of a common ground there already is and how this has moved, and bringing Germany to that level and saying, we need to actually probably take a more pragmatic, realistic, slightly more skeptical approach to China, and need to maybe put our own preferences in the back a little bit for a bigger European good that will then lead to greater prosperity also for the Germans in an age of enhanced competition. Could be a way forward, but that will require a lot of kind of German change in the mindset of how to approach this in the European context.
That was very think tanky too.
Yeah, that was kind of think tanky. Yeah, because I mean, what I want to know. I mean, I think you set the stage really well. You did what think tankers often do, is you delineated the issues, but you didn't tell us what was going to happen, which is what I want to know. And fundamentally, in this case, I want to understand. We're at the eve of this election. We're at the eve of this coalition formation. Which of these coalitions, which of these leaders would be better at doing that? And if neither of them is, can another part of Europe do this? Must this be a German function, or if Germany is relatively weak, either politically or economically, are the French or some other combination of European powers capable of this?
I think let me start with the latter one. I think the Germans do not have to lead this, but if they're in the way of it, it's not going to work. So if they just kind of step back and say, we kind of collectively need to take this over because we really don't know what to do yet, that could work. But if the Germans are actively opposed to any changes, it's not going to happen. So that's the one thing. And I think what we've seen around the AUKUS developments in the last few days, we can probably still say, it's probably still allowed to say that, is that big rifts around big strategic questions can emerge and can make the conversation between the Germans and the French and the Polish, for example, very difficult, and the transatlantic angle will always play into the China conversation that we're playing. So it's a complex game that we're currently seeing. Now, I don't think that necessarily one can say right now, Laschet or Scholz will be better at doing this and better at navigating this. We have seen neither of them in a role like this before. So let's see. I mean, the jury's out on who of them would be better at it. But intellectually, I think both the FDP and the Greens are very much there in what their kind of agenda is on these issues, and that could be a helpful force within the government.
And one really interesting thing in any of the new coalitions is that if the Greens and the FDP join forces on a topic, they have the majority. So if they kind of team up,
The majority within the coalition.
within the coalition, so if they really want to push something through, they have a very strong hand. But I mean, they need to agree first.
And it was sort of interesting that the first thing that the Greens and the FDP did right after the election is say, well, we're going to negotiate with each other first. And I think that's an attempt that maybe they see that I at least had anticipated to set the agenda even for the bigger party, which inheres, and I guess, in the coalition dynamics. So the next question from the audience is really about a little bit about Russia, but I think even without Gustav, we can try and handle it. Is any coalition combination likely to reassess the German reliance on Russian gas and the Nord Stream project specifically? This has been in the news a lot recently.
I think this is super easy to answer. So there is no coalition that would change things on the ground that would undo Nord Stream 2. I think we need to live with that as a given fact, and we need to hedge against the possible consequences. I think we need to prepare for what's next, like in Ukraine, and what is Putin up to. But I think nobody, and not the Chancellor Laschet nor the Chancellor Scholz, would undo Nord Stream 2, even with a lot of pressure coming from the Green and the FDP party.
What about the broader question of reliance on Russian gas, which is not just about Nord Stream, but it's about the sort of future of the European and German energy mix?
But I mean, here I think we will see strong green influence, hopefully, in the next government, because I think one of the core issues, but Janka knows more about this than I do, but of the core issues of the Green Party is the ecological transformation, not of our economy, but also of kind of our energy supplies. And so I think that Nord Stream 2 is, from the Green perspective, I mean, wrong for many political reasons, but also completely out of step with kind of modernity. It's kind of an outdated, old-fashioned idea, and I think the Greens would very much push the Germans to transfer their energy markets. The problem is, from the Green perspective, I mean, a lot of people have actually started to argue that maybe this idea to end kind of the dependency on nuclear energy was premature, kind of Merkel's decision after Fukushima, but I don't see any kind of government with Green participation to go back to that.
Yeah, that I can for sure say is not going to happen. I think that's a no-go for the Green conversation.
Maybe to make it just a little bit more precise, this question about whether the Greens will be successful in moving either of these two putative coalitions toward the type of policy that Jana was talking about, which is a lot less reliance on Russian gas.
Yeah, I think that would definitely be the objective and the attempt, and a strong focus on, and that I think is where also the FDP comes in again to say, we need to run faster, innovate faster, have more technological solutions to this. We cannot look at solutions from the past. So I see the dynamic that could emerge around this, and to say we need to move on these issues. And so that problem will take care of itself eventually. I mean, there's no one saying we need to move out of gas immediately, but it is, the question of how much longer will this be a strategic issue, and to take that time down as much as possible. That seems a reasonable approach. Whether that is going to work in any kind of coalition, I think it's really hard to say right now where this will all pan out and how this will all shape up. But I think the impetus will definitely be there.
And can I have a finger on the overall Russia policy?
Yes, you can, but I'd also like you to address something that you sort of briefly alluded to, which is that the deal that Chancellor Merkel made with the Americans really over Nord Stream was that they would be a lot more forward-leaning on Ukraine, and particularly that they would be attending in various ways to Ukrainian energy security and attending to Ukrainian independence, generally speaking. Is that something that this coalition, while accepting Nord Stream 2, is going to be willing to pursue?
Up to a certain limit. I think if you have watched closely the kind of the trip that Robert Habeck did to Ukraine a while ago, when he came back and basically had the idea we need to provide Ukraine with kind of defensive weapons, shows you that there is a lot of sympathy in the Green camp for Ukraine, for the Ukrainian case. And that has been, I think, very visible from the start after 2014. Actually, the Greens are, I would say, most hawkish on Russia. The my personal problem with that is that I'm doubtful that they kind of want to back up this with a military approach that I think is needed vis-a-vis Russia. But on principle, when it comes to civil society, human rights, and I think they would be ready. The problem always is that how much would Germany be willing to step on Russia's toes? And there, I think, is a very clear, very cautious limit, because I think, and that brings me back to Laschet and Scholz. I think both have very much the long-term relationship with Russia still in mind. They keep emphasizing that in the long run, we cannot lose Russia. And so it's very much, it's not about, well, you could call this appeasement, but it's very much, very sympathetic, I think, to what Emmanuel Macron has come up with, kind of this idea to have a strategic dialogue with Russia, a summit, something that Merkel already embraced. So I see that coming from the Chancellery then, but a lot of sympathies and also a lot of willingness to back this up, and even more robustly than I thought.
So this implies maybe a greater meeting of the mind, for better or for worse, between the French and the Germans on Russian policy.
I think it's, if it goes too far, the Greens would be trying to block this again. So I think it's in the coalition. It's, yeah, like always in Germany, it's a carefully crafted balance.
But I think what we've seen around this is that the argument from the French side has also been one of, let's kind of claw Russia back out of the hands of the Chinese and pull them into our European sphere. And I think that is a kind of misguided analysis at the moment. This is not what we are going to see. This is not the kind of policies that are very likely going to happen. So any kind of rhetoric coming out that says that we need to be closer to Russia to kind of push away China, that seems to me like not the right kind of strategic approach.
And that's super interesting, because the Greens actually are the only party that embrace the Biden narrative of autocracies versus democracies as a frame for what we see in the international sphere out there. The other parties are much more reluctant, but that's also why I think the Greens would never kind of, they see China and Russia both as threats to liberal democracy, and yeah, that's why they are so hawkish.
Okay, well, there's another unanswered question for us. No, I think that was quite helpful. The next question comes from Denitsa Devic. What can we expect from the German G7 presidency next year, which is coming at obviously a pretty crucial time, because it always does. But what Denitsa means by this is it's coming in terms of other important multilateral global developments like the EU compass, NATO strategic concept, and all these unilateral groupings that are arising. So I know we haven't even figured out which coalition is coming, but what could they possibly do with the G7 presidency? I think we've seen various countries, including Italy, have been making quite a good use of that presidency recently. Nobody wants to start it. No, after you. All right, I'll assign Janka to that since it's been starting.
So I think that's one of those questions where it's really hard to say. Of course, you can make a lot out of it if you have a functioning government by that time. If you have an agenda, and if you listen to what Habeck yesterday, basically saying, we need a vision for this. We need to not go through line by line and line by line of what a coalition agreement could look like, but we need a vision for what this government should be doing. If you have that, if you were able to create that by that time,
okay, well, let's play that thought exercise then. I mean, through a sort of weird series of missteps, Robert Habeck becomes the chancellor. And he's able to form some sort of ideal G7 agenda. What could Germany do if it had the kind of internal unity that you're talking about?
So I think on the G7 agenda is the China question, and that is the big one. And that is the big one that needs to be addressed. And so it brings it back to the question of how active can Europe shape its own role in this emerging conversation that we have internationally, the US versus China, autocracies versus democracies. What exactly is Europe's position in this context going to look like? And how forceful can Europeans construct their own interests in this, in a way that is kind of on eye level with the Americans, particularly on the economic front? And this is where, that's why the TTC is more important right now, that's coming up, and all of these questions that we're seeing. But the question of, does Europe understand its own weight in shaping kind of the global response to a rising China, or does it punch below its weight continuously? And that is something that remains to be seen. If there is an active German pushing for that, And there's an active embrace of saying we need transatlantic and Indo-Pacific alliances to build a strong kind of future for European prosperity and security. Then obviously there is a huge potential in that. Whether they are going to be ready for that yet, we'll see.
Can I have two finger? Not on China. I mean, if it is true, what I think is true, that the next German government, foreign policy-wise, will have a lot of priorities that we've seen previously. I think a strong emphasis, so very German, on multilateralism, on some agenda points like global health. Again, I think that is something that Germany has been advocating for a long time, has actually been a pet topic for Chancellor Merkel, but also the global commons, these topics. So multilateral attempts to solving the problems of the 21st century. I think that will be kind of the overall spirit that the Germans will want to embrace.
Okay, let's maybe move on to the next question, which is appropriately about the, I think it sort of leads into this because it's about the transatlantic relationship. And I mean, it's from Lina Lund. I'm sorry, it's from Lina Lund Hebels. What are your thoughts on the relations to the U.S. and what can we expect from a new coalition on the U.S. discourse, particularly with regards to strategic autonomy? And I mean, I think we can take that question in both directions. One from you in terms of the EU strategic autonomy debate, but also in terms of recently we saw that it's not too easy to form a transatlantic policy on China. So how will the new coalition be able to deal with that?
So, but maybe you come in as well, because you always tell me that kind of transatlantic relationship is not kind of what it has been, is very much changing also from the American side, and maybe you can bring kind of an American perspective in here, because I think that,
I'm the moderator, I have no opinions.
Because I think this modern approach to the transatlantic relationship, again, is very much visible, or much more visible, looking at the Green Party and the FDP, the two smaller parties. If you, like Annalena Baerbock and Robert Habeck have published a 5-point plan on the kind of new transatlantic relationship, less centered around NATO and kind of the defense alliance, and kind of more also thinking or including other topics, like, for example, kind of a transatlantic alliance to combat climate change as one of the core ideas, and other things. But I think looking at the very kind of traditionally transatlantic aspects, and then that brings me to security and defense, I think that we have talked forever about the 2% defense spending. So, I mean, even under a conservative chancellor, we will never get there. I mean, we had 16 years and we never made it. But that will be a bigger issue for the SPD and the Greens. And what I think is maybe interesting to watch from an American perspective is the whole debate about nuclear sharing that we will see. That might have an effect on the transatlantic relationship, because last year, Rolf Mützenich, a very influential MP of the Social Democratic Party, published basically a paper where he laid out his plan how to get rid of the nuclear sharing arrangement, and why, after the end of the INF Treaty, now it was the time to leave the arrangement. And it got a lot of sympathies in the SPD, including from the party leadership, from Saskia Esken and Norbert Walter Borjans. And the left wing of the SPD, which got stronger over the years. So Olaf Scholz is basically an outlier in his own party. We need to remind that. We need to remember this. And so nuclear sharing is, I think, something that nobody wants to leave overnight, but where I mean, in a coalition with the Conservatives are the only party that really insists that this should kind of remain in place. The FDP to a certain extent, but a couple of years ago they advocated for the opposite, so I'm not so sure, honestly. But anyhow, so in a traffic light coalition without the CDU, I mean, the SPD and the Greens would have basically nobody to blame for, kind of nobody who would need to give them anything to make that compromise. And it's not only about this commitment, it's about a procurement decision. It's about a super expensive procurement decision because it's about the tornado replacement. Maybe that all goes too much into detail here, but I think this is really interesting to watch. If that will make it into the coalition treaty and kind of what kind of wording they will find and what they will do with the kind of Stone Age tornadoes and how they want to replace them in the future. So in the traditional security and defense front, I see some turmoil, maybe little.
Well, I mean, I understand the import about the nuclear sharing agreement, but I guess I'm not quite following you on what all of this means for strategic autonomy generally. And I think that there is a sort of, let's say, a fundamental philosophical question going on in Europe and but particularly in Germany right now about whether Europeans need to move away from the Americans, whether they have become, in the light of the Trump administration and AUKUS and all the in Afghanistan, either too unreliable or too incompetent or too distracted by Asia to really be attending to the needs of the allies and to the defense needs of Europe. So, and you know, I think Germany, the current coalition, Merkel herself has been ambivalent on this point for a long time, and I guess it's a pretty good prediction in Germany that ambivalence will continue. Because do we have any hint from this coalition and that maybe that won't? And actually, I mean, to sort of push you a little bit, it seemed to me that you were saying maybe that the SPD-led coalition actually would be taking a stand on this.
The SPD-led coalition would maybe be a little more open to the idea of strategic autonomy, and traditionally the SPD is more skeptical when it comes to transatlantic relations. But Olaf Scholz himself is an exception. He had kind of made this NATO point all over his campaign because, I mean, he wanted to assure people that he did not want to join forces with the left party, which is now not an option any longer. But I think this ambiguity that you have observed, I think will continue because there are different forces within Germany and sometimes even within the party. So whenever I talk to someone from the German military and also the defense ministry, there is a huge reluctance to do anything that weakens or that they think will weaken the transatlantic angle. And I see that all over Europe right now, and there is a certain nervousness now after AUKUS. So there is this idea that this project at EU level, the strategic compass, I think this is very much about strategic autonomy. So the idea that the EU kind of gives itself kind of some sort of doctrine, what to do in military and defense terms in the future. And after AUKUS, a few governments in the EU got very nervous and skeptical and thought that maybe, and also that they thought that the United States will not like this. I don't know if that was Biden's statement, when Biden and Macron had this phone call and Biden wholeheartedly, I don't know if that's how it was felt, embrace this idea, if that will actually change things. I personally think that a lot of people don't want to do more on the EU level because they don't believe it's going to work, because the Europeans don't get their act together.
Okay, well, I mean, I think German ambivalence is a pretty solid prediction, so I feel good about that. But it's interesting when it comes particularly to the sort of transatlantic question on China. One wonders whether ambivalence is really possible, because as we saw in the AUKUS ruckus, which almost rhymes, the Americans are moving forward on China. They are sort of taking a sort of no-hold-barred approach to the transatlantic alliance when it comes to that issue. You're sort of either with us or against us. Get on the board or get out of the way. I wonder if one of these coalitions, if the next German leader is going to be willing to sort of take or able to take a more unambivalent approach to China, or by contrast, do you end up in a place sort of where France was, where you're sort of standing by the side, trying to get your opinion heard. I'll move this a little bit closer to.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this before, but I do think that the next German government will have to answer the fundamental strategic question, which is it in our strategic interest that the United States and its allies maintain military dominance in the Indo-Pacific region? This is the most important growth region. This is key for European prosperity. It is key for German business interests, and we will need to answer that question. Ducking it will not work, and AUKUS was a really good lesson in that, because it's not the US moving fast. Is everything moving fast, and the US just kind of being part of that. And it is also something that I think needs to sink in really deeply is the strategic context within which this is taking place. All those partners that we keep talking about that we have in the Indo-Pacific region that also make kind of European strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty sound good because we have other options, capacity to act. We have the Japanese and the Australians and the Indians, they're also moving pretty fast. So if we want to make any sense of that and don't want European isolation as an option, but actual capacity to act, then it will require to catch up to some of the developments that are taking place. And some of the understanding that what we are seeing in the region are preparations for war is a very intense military setting that we are seeing. And I think this is, we just have to come to terms with that. And it's not optional any longer because this region is of incredible economic importance for us. It's not Afghanistan.
Look, I think that you do a very good job of demonstrating that this is necessary.
Whether it will happen.
If I've learned anything about European governance in the last 70 years, is that just because something is necessary
doesn't necessarily mean it will happen. Correct.
So I guess my question to you is, okay, it's necessary. I totally accept that. Will it happen? And what are the differences between in the CDU versus SDP leadership in terms of making it likely to happen?
So I don't know if, I think Jana said this before, it's not necessarily, the dividing lines are not between parties, but within parties. And so it will depend on where do these coalitions of the different players fall in the end. And you will have strong voices in each of the parties that will advocate for one or the other. It will also depend on how much you can interlink this. Now, if the lesson from AUKUS is, hang on, wait a minute, this was a wake-up call, things are moving super fast, we need to do something about this, and that's actually a good thing, because then it will probably lead to a reassessment. If the lesson is, well, the Americans don't want to consult with us anyway, so we should block everything else as well, we shouldn't talk about data, we shouldn't talk about technology, then that's a different conclusion that comes out of it, and one or the other will lead, from my assessment, to more or less capacity to act. So I think yes.
I think we know which one you're talking
yes.
about. Yeah. But let me narrow in a little bit on something you said in your first answer, which I think is super interesting, and a little bit on German, which is that you said that there is the military balance in the region really matters, and that AUKUS wasn't just a crisis of transatlantic consultations; it was an actual effort by the Americans and the Australians and the British to change the military balance in East Asia, which I think you were pointing out is matters.
Yeah, and I think you can come out on each side of this, but I think you need to just kind of recognize that is what's going on. So I think there's.
My question would be, how does or does it at all? Does the EU and Germany play into that military balance, the issue of military dominance, the question of military dominance in the Asia Pacific? Are they going to be acknowledging that and playing in that game, or is that simply something that the Americans do with the Australians and the Europeans coming from the sidelines?
Yeah, I think that, so. What I think first thing is we keep saying, well, we obviously can't play a military role in this region. It's impossible for us to play. It is a choice. We have allocated resources in a way that will lead to an outcome that we currently have, that we do not play a military role in the region. I'm not advocating for changing that, but I'm just saying it is a strategic choice to do that. It is a strategic choice to allocate resources in a certain way. And there is no fundamental kind of cosmic reason why the Europeans could not have a military that plays a role in the Indo-Pacific region. That said, I do think that we cannot ignore what is going on militarily. That doesn't mean that there needs to be a military answer to that. I think there needs to be a reassessment of how we position ourselves to the developments that are taking place. I think there needs to be a very, very serious engagement with the question of non-proliferation, with a kind of arms race that is going on, or that will materialize from this. We need to talk to all of our partners in the region there. I don't think that is necessarily made better by having more military in the region, but just accepting the fact that this is ongoing and being a strategic player in this, making options, putting options on the table.
Do you see that awareness growing on German politics generally, or even with these coalitions?
Yeah, and I think it was quite interesting to see. No, I do.
We have a little disagreement.
I do, because I also think that from the it's been kind of brushed away, the fact that we have a frigate sent to the region and this means nothing and this is really not important. But the fact that within a very short time frame, from a French-led, very security-focused Indo-Pacific engagement, we are now at a point where we have an EU, all members kind of buying into it, Indo-Pacific approach, where this region has become a completely different, where there is a completely different set around the questions that are being posed around it. That's already a big step. And the Germans also acting in the security space there, that is actually a big step. And it may be seeming like a baby step to many, but I do think it takes a couple of baby steps to get somewhere.
Can I?
You can say what's just
Yeah,
wrong, absolutely. Please do.
I mean, not entirely wrong, but first of all, I think China, very German. So first of all, I think China is not perceived as a military threat seen from Germany. I think that kind of whole military dimension is completely, strange for us to understand. And that is also because your question was basically, do the Germans realize that military power matters, that it makes a strategic difference, what you have on offer, what you kind of can deploy. And from a German perspective, the military is not seen to be such an instrument. It's not seen as an instrument, not even for politics. It's not seen in a strategic way, kind of you were framing it. And that is a fundamental.
I was noticing in this August debate that you rarely hear people talking about the submarines.
It's just
the only thing people talk about in the United States.
And that is because of Germany's strategic culture, and kind of to think of the military in these ways is something that Germans usually don't do. And the third thing, and I think the frigate illustrates that very nicely, because of course, I'm totally with you. I think it was a very good idea. It came from the defense ministry, and the defense ministry would be completely on board, I think, with your assessment. But then the chancellery basically intervened and wanted that stop in Shanghai, just in order to be ambiguous again and to have that balance and to signal to the Chinese, yeah, we're doing this, but don't take it too personally. I mean, there's nothing to see here. And I think it was very interesting that the Chinese didn't use this opportunity for PR and said, yeah, the Germans are coming, but kind of refused that offer and put the Germans a bit on the spot so that they now need to decide what they really want to do in the Indo-Pacific. And so I think the frigate is a good idea. And some people rethink all this now, but I think there is a lot of persistence when it comes to the role of the military in general. And I think the thinking is more, yes, then the Americans do the Indo-Pacific and we do our own backyard more. And we do Russia, I mean, to the extent that we can do it, and we do, the neighborhood, but kind of this is out of our reach, the Indo-Pacific.
An ocean too far.
Yes.
Okay, well, let's move back a little bit closer, well, actually a lot bit closer to home. We have a question from Eric Johansson about the Baltics and the Nordics. He's noting that we've been talking a lot about the European context, but we've been referring to France and to a little bit to Poland and to the states to the south of Germany. Do the Baltics and Nordics, are they a flank that's relevant in Germany and not talked about? Has this been something that's been in the campaign at all?
So, I mean, in general, something that is maybe a bit comforting for the Nordics and the Baltics when I tell them that they didn't play any role. But the comforting thing here is that maybe other countries didn't really play a role. So in our election campaign, nothing came up. I think, with the exception, for example, when the Greens emphasized that everything they will do on the NATO portfolio, including nuclear sharing, needs to be closely coordinated with Central and Eastern Europe. I think here you saw that this region matters for Germans a lot. And I think that this is regardless of the candidates.
But how does this fit into the point you made, particularly about the SPD-led coalition, that they might be taking a more French-oriented approach to Russia, which would obviously be quite obnoxious to the Baltics and most of the Nordics.
Yes, absolutely, a lot of pushback. But I think Germany would again try to do what we always do, take everybody on board, like what Merkel did for 16 years, try to kind of be the bridge builder, the spider in the web, and also leading the EU. Like after 2014, I mean, Germany has also a very positive track record when it comes to kind of leading the EU's Russia policy and finding the right way how then to actually achieve something. But so I think that the way how German politicians, all of them look at the EU is really inclusive still. And so that's where also problems with Macron, I think, would be apparent, kind of this idea to move only forward with a few European partners and kind of throw the rest out of the window. I mean, maybe exaggerated, but I think many politicians, and especially the candidates, have realized that this taking everybody on board all the time makes us really too slow. And so Annalena Baerbock and Armin Laschet, and I think with Olaf Scholz, I'm not so sure, but I think he has emphasized these two, but certainly Laschet and Baerbock have said we need to maybe think more in terms of coalitions of the willing inside the EU framework and maybe move forward with only a few partners. Both have emphasized not leaving anybody behind, very German again, but I think it will come to that, basically also trade-off. And I would,
Consensus is time consuming.
Do you want to get the China angle of that one as well? Because there is.
I did actually. We're way ahead because Eric actually brought that up in his question. Because he'd been noting that China has been bullying poor little Lithuania.
And Sweden.
For quite some time. So, and I guess this, I feel to a degree you've already answered this in some of your previous questions, but I think it might be good to put it in the context of the Nordics and Baltics. Is Germany going to stand up for its partners?
Yeah, should we care?
When it comes to these types of...
So whether we will, I don't know. Whether we should, I'm very certain. And whether European solidarity will be on the agenda.
I think everybody wants to know will.
Whether we will.
Yeah.
So there is a strong push from within the Green Party, that is for sure. And there's a strong push from the Liberals as well to stand up for values-based policy as well. So I think that will just, and that's one thing.
But to be fair, this isn't just about values.
No,
It is about values, but this is about geopolitical muscle.
And
whether the EU means something as an entity in negotiating with China.
Absolutely, and I think it is about the question of how do you deal with political and economic coercion in the future? What kind of role do you want to play in that? And what kind of economic policies can you construct out of that? Would that actually strengthen your muscle and will not make you look like you have nothing to offer? And I think Lithuania has demonstrated that China is actually weak on these issues at the moment, that if you want to push the envelope on these things, you actually can right now, but there needs to be a general assessment that, or a general realization that this is also changing quickly and that China's muscle is growing on a lot of these questions. So the question of whether you push the envelope now when you can't push it later is one that is going to be very important for all of these questions, and the instruments being built on EU level that are able to just build this shell and this resilience in a way that is in Europe's broader interest. I do think that there is a lot of potential within the next government. I do see more of potential in that in the Traffic Light Commission, because you want me to make these statements, so I will make one here.
Actually, the point of this conference, thank you for that. That was an actual answer.
Yes.
We've moved a little bit.
We're almost at 12:30, so we can get to actual answers now.
Fantastic. I think we have one last question also from Denise and Delic, which fits into this, and that's the question of relations with the United Kingdom, which interestingly,
answer probably.
You know, it's still it hasn't actually moved. It's still there. It's still 20 miles from the coast of France. But you don't really hear it talked about very much anymore. It felt sometimes from the German election campaign as if the UK had just gone away. And the questioner points out that actually Merkel was pretty good at trying to tamp down the sort of brewing British-French disputes and trying to make Brexit as stabilizing as possible. Is there going to be any change in that from either of these coalitions?
No, I don't think so. I think when it comes to Brexit, the new German chancellor doesn't make a huge difference. I think the overall priority will still be, we have outsourced this to the EU level, so we do know.
No, but we've moved beyond Brexit. Brexit has happened. Now we're talking about a relationship with the UK.
But still, I mean, Brexit has happened, but there are still some important things that kind of remain on the table, like the Northern Ireland Protocol and all these nitty-gritty details. And here I don't see any change. I think any of the chancellors, possible chancellors, would like to try to work with the UK. But I think the priority for all of them would be not to make the bilateral relationship more important than the EU level. So everything that Germany wants to do with the UK needs to be embedded and fit within a European framework. And to some extent, I think we are less, like for what we consider, for example, kind of this French idea, coming back to security and defense again, of the European Intervention Initiative and bringing the UK on board to something outside the EU that might actually work, but it's not in the EU with the UK. We are more skeptical about this. So we would, I mean, we want good bilateral relationships, but we would always prioritize kind of the EU. But within the EU, vis-a-vis the UK, we would still try to be that balancing figure. And I mean, you have seen some remarks. I remember them particularly from Armin Laschet, saying that he wants also some sort of security partnership with the UK and wants to include them into the overall European foreign and security architecture. And I think that would be preferable for Germans and maybe. But the problem I see here is the UK government not really on board with this.
That's a bit of an issue. All right, I think we've hit our time, covered a lot of issues. We've even answered a few questions, so I think that's quite impressive. Obviously, there's a lot more to find out, a lot of coalitions formation yet to happen, so we'll probably be back having this conversation, correcting everything we said today.
With better audio quality, maybe.
Maybe even with better audio quality, you never know. But thank you for joining us, thank you for your questions, and have a good day.